Well, next on the programme, we're going to take a look at the international reaction, specifically the European reaction to the American capture of Maduro. Nicholas Morgan is with me live on the programme now. He's the director of the Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Newcastle University. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us.
Hello again. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Look, and it's good to talk to you about this story. Let's start then with Donald Trump. He's been explicit, hasn't he, that the events in Venezuela are at least partly about oil. We have the United Nations Human Rights Office today saying that the capture of Maduro undermines international law. However, European leaders have been rather muted, haven't they, in their criticism of the United States. We even had Emmanuel Macron initially saying that we could only rejoice at what had happened. Macron has walked back a little on those comments. But my question to you is, why are we seeing the EU, the UK, being so limited in their criticism of the US? Are they scared of Donald Trump?
Well, they clearly are scared of Donald Trump. I mean, we need to spend a little bit of time to think about what's actually happened. Yeah. So we've, got to return to what you might think of as 19th century gunboat diplomacy or something from the 1930s. The Guardian's Julian Borgia talked about 19th century politics with the 21st century weapons. So, I'm no fan of Nicolás Maduro, and I'm not an apologist for Chavismo. He probably is, excuse me, an illegitimate president. But Trump has flagrantly broken international law. He's taken aggressive action in violation of another state's sovereignty. He's kidnapped a head of state on, pardon the pun, trumped-up charges. And rather than using the usual excuses about, a return to democracy and all those sorts of things, he's clearly, foregrounded the notion of oil. The previous regime, or the current regime, as still is actually, is only illegitimate for him insofar as it doesn't allow him to achieve his economic goal, which is complete control of Venezuela's resources. And he appeals without irony to the Donroe Doctrine, in self-aggrandizing fashion referred to as the Donroe Doctrine. But at least the Donroe Doctrine had was legitimized because it was there supposedly to resist European imperialism in Latin America. Now, we don't get that. Trump really isn't seeking that kind of legitimacy. This is raw power. It's showing that the US is the regional hegemon. The drug war discourse is there for sure. We've heard something about that already in the program, but it really is a nonsense. And he's using it to threaten Gustavo Petro in Colombia and Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. And the underlying message is simple. So Latin America belongs to us. We get to use their resources in our interests, and to hell with anyone who gets in our way. Now, that's the dilemma for the EU. How do we respond to that from Europe? Because European soft power has always been based on a liberal vision of a rules-based international order. And of course, there may have been a lot of hypocrisy in this. That order has always been flouted at times by powerful actors, right? But it's been very important, and it has been something that people have been able to appeal to. There's been a perceived need to appeal to a liberal discourse foregrounded on notions of human rights and the sovereignty of individual states. So you can imagine the consternation in diplomatic circles in Europe now. Trump's using brute force in some cases, in others he's using economic clout. And of course, the war over tariffs is very much in European policymakers' minds, right? There's still the threat of a 50% tariff on European steel and so on and so forth. So we've had a very mixed reaction in Europe. Spain, Norway, the Netherlands, they've condemned Trump's actions. Spain's done so in conjunction with Latin American countries rather than with European countries, which is significant, I think, in itself. Other countries like Germany and the UK, where I am, have fudged the issue of legality completely. And others like Italy have essentially endorsed everything Trump's done. In fact, we've had here in the UK, we've had the leader of the Conservative Party talking about the moral rightness of what Trump did in Venezuela. And of course, we've got the problem with Greenland. We've had the statement today about Greenland, threats to take over what is essentially part of Europe, right? Which essentially would be the end of NATO. It would be a fundamental threat to European sovereignty. But this is the world that we're in. And all of this has to be seen from within the context of the US's national security review, which caused a lot of kerfuffle in Europe, right? In many ways, we can see the US drawing back from its role as the global hegemon. It's thinking more about its regional role. But it's talked a lot about things like, cultural erasure in Europe, which really speaks to a whole range of far-right talking points. So the problem for Europe at the moment is that it's, caught between a rock and a hard place, between the potential of interference from two world powers, the US and Russia. And the US no longer being, what's the word for it? The umbrella, the security umbrella, the security blanket that Europe always counted on. And that's really disturbing.
Yeah, and if I may, I want to pick up on something you said there about Greenland. As you've been arguing, in your view, Europe rather weak here, certainly looking very divided with different EU countries saying different things towards Donald Trump now. We again have Stephen Miller, top advisor to Donald Trump, again threatening Greenland this week. Can Europe stand alone? Is it going to be united if there is some kind of potential attack on Greenland? It's certainly not that united at the moment, is it, on Ukraine?
No, that's right. I mean, all of this is revealing the many cracks that exist within the European Union, right? Politically, in all sorts of ways. We've seen the resurgence of a populist right across the whole bloc, which is really problematic and which has fed into mainstream politics. I mean, your question's a really good one, and I can't answer it. Who knows? Perhaps a US direct threat to Greenland might produce some kind of unifying effect in Europe. It's hard to say. But if we're looking at a world which is, I would say right now, being divided into regional interest blocks, Russia, China, US, Europe is extremely weak. It doesn't seem to have got the memo that this is not the world which existed in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union. This is a new world order, and Europe seems to be woefully prepared for it. So I can't really answer your question, but it's one which causes a lot of anxiety. And I would say also, I mean, let's just go back briefly to Latin America. I mean, Latin America, as Porfirio Diaz said, its misfortune being so far from God and so close to the United States. What has Europe got to offer to our partners in Latin America? Are we going to show solidarity and respect for democratic norms with them? Or are we just going to kowtow to Donald Trump? And that seems to be, well, it's a huge problem for European diplomacy. I can't resolve it. And it certainly doesn't seem to be being resolved right now.
And just a final question for you then. Yesterday, we were listening here on the programme to a little of the United Nations General Assembly. And with your expertise on Latin America, I'd like to ask you about Colombia, the Colombian diplomat at the Security Council, speaking with great concern and anger, frankly, over the scenes in Venezuela. How concerned do you think Colombia should be that it's in Donald Trump's sights next?
Well, they should be concerned. I mean, the so-called charges against Gustavo Petro are a tissue of lies. They are absolutely absurd. To claim that Petro is, part of a cartel is an utter nonsense. And it is a disgrace, actually, that, these things seem to go unchallenged in Europe. Yes, I mean, Petro won't be in power for very long. He's coming to the end of his term, and who knows who will replace him. So we'll have to wait and see. But this is all part of the US using the war on drugs discourse as a big stick to threaten everybody in its so-called backyard. And this is a really disturbing return to that kind of politics.
All right. Nicholas Morgan from the Centre of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Newcastle University. Thanks very much.